We all know why we're here to hear Selina. I suspect that, certainly in terms of Selina and Evelyn Waugh, she needs very little introduction. I would guess that pretty well everyone here has at some stage read her book, which I'm sure we would all unanimously agree is amazingly fluent and brilliant. It was the third full Evelyn Waugh biography, I think, well, certainly the third one of any great importance. First one, of course, being Christopher Sykes, who had the great advantage of having known Evelyn Waugh, and also was the first to have access to Evelyn Waugh's diaries. Sykes turned out to be a little bit insane, and got a bit upset about certain things he found in the diaries, and I think it turned a bit malicious against his old friend. Would have written, I think, a much better memoir and kept it at that, and not bothered with a biography, and very serious omissions. In fact, Sykes forgot to mention that Evelyn Waugh had a child called James, who was his own godson, and omitted to interview a lot of very important people. Then came Martin Stannard, who's amongst us now, and I think everybody's read his very excellent 2-volume. Martin's great strengths, I think, were access to the incoming correspondence, and of course an absolutely incredible research mind. So he turned up a lot of very interesting things and put everything in context, and I think was also very brilliant on analysis of the text and the books. And then Selina, and what Selina offered was very unique because she got to meet all of a lot of the people who knew Evelyn Waugh personally and were his great friends, all of whom are now dead, and that, you know, and that's sort of everybody really, ligands and family retainers, servants, friends, Graham Greens, and all those sorts of people. And I think Selina's really great genius is getting people to talk, and my God, she got them to talk. And in her generosity, I mentioned this yesterday, she gave me her papers and transcripts, and I can see how those interviews with those people worked, and some of them started very, very stiff and reluctant to engage at all, and by the end of the interview you can see that she's really got their tongues waggling and they're saying all sorts of things they really had no business saying. But the fact is they're all dead, and so Selina's book and Selina's archives are really extremely important relics of the whole Evelyn Waugh story. Anyway, as you probably might not know about going outside of Evelyn Waugh, she's written absolutely very moving, brilliant book on Somerset Maugham, which made me cry actually in the end. It was so absolutely awful what happened to him. A brilliant book on Rosamund Leyland. She's an expert on Nancy Mitford, written a book on Nancy Mitford. An extraordinary life of her own father, who was an ally of Diego Rivera and a sort of communist earl, and now working in civil Bedford. But anyway, what we're going to hear about today, I think, is Evelyn Waugh and Nancy Mitford, and then we can turn it into questions. I think Selina will be very happy to take questions on any other aspects of her war work or anything you want. So, big welcome, Selina Hastings.
Thank you very much. You can hear me. My voice disappeared entirely 2 days ago, but it's just beginning to come back now. Well, I want to talk about what I can best describe as the pupil-teacher relationship that existed for almost 15 years between Evelyn Waugh, the teacher, and Nancy Mitford, the pupil. Their friendship endured much longer, but this particular and very charming aspect of it existed while Nancy was engaged in writing her 3 best novels, The Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, and The Blessing. The two of them were almost exact contemporaries. Waugh was born in October 1903, Nancy Mitford in November 1904. They didn't meet until 1928, when Waugh married Evelyn Gardner, a great chum of Nancy's. But they already had a number of friends in common, mainly Evelyn Waugh's Oxford contemporaries, members of the dandy aesthete set, such as Robert Byron, Harold Acton, Hamish Erskine, and Mark Ogilvy Grant. After the wedding, the two Evelyns, he Evelyn and she Evelyn, as they were cutely called, moved into a flat in Canterbury Square. At this time, Evelyn Waugh was working on his second novel, Vile Bodies, and in order to write undisturbed, spent Mondays to Fridays in the country, returning to London only at weekends. Nancy moved into the flat to keep she Evelyn company, but the arrangement didn't last long. Within a year, Evelyn Gardner had left her husband for another man, and Nancy, shocked by what she regarded as her friend's flighty behaviour, sided wholeheartedly with the abandoned husband. Nancy was a great admirer of Evelyn's Decline and Fall, published in the year of his marriage, and also of Vile Bodies, which came out in 1930, a year before she published her first novel, Highland Fling. It would be unfair to say that Highland Fling was written in direct imitation, but Waugh's influence is clearly detectable, with the same sort of bright young people, gay and frivolous, prattling on in a bright young, fashionably idiomatic manner. Even the opening of Nancy's book recalls the opening of Vile Bodies, with the hero, Albert Gates, like Adam Fenwick Symes, returning from Paris on the cross-channel steamer, and like Adam, having the book confiscated by customs on arrival in England, though in Albert's case, it is not the manuscript of his memoirs that is pounced on, but a smuggled copy of Ulysses. Throughout the 1930s, Evelyn and Nancy continued to see each other from time to time. He advised her against marriage to the flamboyantly homosexual Hamish Erskine, with whom for a while she imagined herself in love, and was dismayed when she married Peter Rodd, a handsome but delinquent adventurer with whom Evelyn had been at Oxford, and from whom he drew much of his inspiration for that bad buccaneer Basil Seal. After her marriage, to keep herself occupied, Nancy edited 2 volumes of 19th century family letters, The Ladies of Alderley and The Stanleys of Alderley, and it was Evelyn who arranged for his father's firm, Chapman and Hall, of which he was himself a director, to publish them. In her preface to The Ladies of Alderley, Nancy, with a courageous disregard for historical truth, expounds a rather childlike political philosophy which was not dissimilar to Evelyn's own. She, like him, revealing a strong nostalgia for the past as a kind of Gilbertian golden age in which every Englishman knew his place, and where the Lord, a sensible man of ample means and a classical education, lived in perfect harmony with the commoner at his gate. It is only with the coming of what she calls the terrible 20th century that this delightful arrangement breaks down, resulting in segregation of the classes and a fatal loss of trust between ruler and ruled. This chimes in closely with Evelyn's notorious loathing of the modern world and his conviction that the barbarian hordes were already through the gate and fast destroying the beauty and tranquility of the preceding centuries. In the self-portrait which he drew in The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, to remember, he says of Mr. Pinfold, his strongest tastes were negative. He abhorred plastics, Picasso's, sunbathing and jazz. Everything, in fact, that had happened in his own lifetime. By the beginning of the war, Nancy's marriage had in effect broken down, and she took a job as an assistant in Haywood Hill's bookshop in Curzon Street. It was during this period that the friendship between Evelyn and Nancy became important to them both. Haywood Hill, as much of a club as a shop, was a favourite port of call for Evelyn, who, when in London, liked to drop in after having his hair cut at Trumpers next door, and before moving on for an afternoon's drinking at White's. When away from London, he relied on Nancy to supply him not only with books, but just as important, with all the latest gossip. For when it came to gossip, Nancy was a purveyor of genius. Like Albertine, the accomplished mistress in The Blessing, the novel she wrote in 1951, Nancy knew exactly how to transform her material, however unexceptional in origin, into glorious entertainment. Not like Albertine, she always had something to recount, not plain slices of life served up on a thick white plate, but wonderful confections embellished with the aromatic and exotic fruits of her own sugary imagination. She had endless tales to spin around their mutual friends. This, of course, to Evelyn was irresistible. An entry in his diary recounts, got away in time to catch Nancy as her shop was closing and take her to tea at the Ritz. She was full of funny stories about Prod and the Duchess of Kent, Cyril Connolly and the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire. It was when Evelyn began work on what he always referred to as his magnum opus, or mag-op, Brideshead Revisited, that the relationship between them grew closer as he began to involve her on a professional level. In 1944, Waugh had succeeded in persuading the army to give him 3 months' leave in order to write, and he had gone down to a small hotel at Chagford in Devon where he habitually stayed when he needed to work undisturbed by friends or family. Chagford provided him with peace and quiet, but while there he had no access to a library. Nancy, in her well-stocked bookshop in Curzon Street, was able to provide a valuable service. On the 18th of May, he wrote to her, "I need 2 quotations badly from Mag Op. A, 3 lines beginning, I, Tiresias, have forsuffered all, wasteland. B, a story by G.K. Chesterton, but first, I think, in the wisdom, I think, of Father Brown called, I think, the fisherman. With regard to A, if you have a copy in the shop, could you be an angel and copy the lines on the postcard?" Brideshead was finished in June 1944, shortly before Evelyn left for Yugoslavia, where he was to serve under Randolph Churchill as liaison officer between the British military and the partisans. Here, cooped up in a tiny cottage with the ebullient Major Churchill, he suffered agonies of boredom, irritation, and melancholia. The delivery of mail, dropped by plane, was tormentingly sporadic. Again, it was Nancy who provided his main lifeline, sending him books from the shop and long gossipy letters. In September, he wrote to her, "Thank you so much for writing so often. All your letters have arrived safely and are worth a guinea apiece to me, so please go on spending sixpences and charge them to Hayward Hill as out-of-pocket expenses in keeping customers' goodwill. The books, of course, haven't arrived yet, but I await them with the keenest expectation." Nancy knew his taste in reading, and on the whole, her choice was much appreciated. One of the books, she said, was Cyril Connolly's The Unquiet Grave. Connolly was a favourite target of Evelyn's, who affected to regard him as a kind of comic stage Irishman, and with time hanging heavy on his hands, he was able to give the work his undivided attention, reporting back to Curzon Street that he was quite fascinated by the book, although forced to admit that Cyril's lovingly garnered collection of pensées was essentially twaddle. He amused himself by annotating his copy in the margins, sending up Connolly's elegant aphorisms with jokes and jeers, like a rude schoolboy twitting a pedantic master. "Complacent mental laziness is the English disease," Cyril had written thoughtfully, says Paddy appears in the margin. "The secret of happiness lies in the avoidance of angst. Voodoo, bog magic, the wise woman's cabin." Brideshead was published in May 1945, but the previous Christmas, the Christmas of '44, while Evelyn was still stuck miserably in Yugoslavia, he arranged for 50 copies of the novel to be specially bound and given as presents to friends. Never before had he been so anxious about a book's reception, never so frustrated at not being on the spot to learn what was being said about it. Again, Nancy was his source, perfectly placed as she was, in the heart of literary London. She was one of the first to read the book, and she responded with enthusiasm. "Brideshead has come," she wrote from the shop on the 22nd of December, "beautiful in original boards of triumph of book production, and a great English classic in my humble opinion. Oh, how I should like to chat about it. There are 1 or 2 things I long to know. Are you or not on Lady Marchmain's side? I couldn't make out. One dreadful error. Diamond clips were only invented about 1930. You wore a diamond arrow in your cloth. It's the only one, which I call good, the only one I spotted at least. I think Charles Ryder might have had a little more glamour. I can't explain why, but he seemed to be a tiny bit dim. And that is the only criticism I have to make, because I'm literally dazzled with admiration." This was exactly the kind of informed, subjective criticism Evelyn had been hoping for. "Yes, I know what you mean. Charles Ryder is dim, but then he's telling the story. It is not his story. I think the crucial question is, does Julia's love for him seem real, or is he so dim that it falls flat? If the latter, the book fails, plainly. He was a bad painter. Well, he was as bad at painting as Osbert Sitwell is at writing, for Christ's sake, don't read the house." "Lady Marchmain, no, I am not on her side, but God is, who suffers fools gladly, and the book is about God. Does that answer it?" Bad about the clip. Too late for the first edition, and there are no second editions these days. I knew I should have submitted it to you first for criticism. The dialogue continued. "I quite see how the person who tells is dim," wrote Nancy, unwilling to let the subject drop. But then, would Julia and her brother and her sister all be in love with him if he was? Well, love is like that, and one can never tell. Now, about what people think. Raymond Mortimer, great English classic. Cyril, brilliant when the narrative is straightforward, doesn't care for the purple passages, i.e. the deathbed or Marchmain, thinks you go too much to rights. Osbert Sitwell, jealous, doesn't like talking about it. SW7, European Royal Quarter, heaven, darling. General view, it is the Ligon family, too much Catholic stuff. At the end of her letter, Nancy added modestly, I'm writing a book, also in the first person. It's about my family, a very different cup of tea, not grand and far madder. Did I begin it before reading Brideshead or after? I can't remember. I've done about 10,000 words and asked for a 3-month holiday to write it, which I believe I shall get. I'm awfully excited. My fingers itch for a pen. The novel to which she refers was The Pursuit of Love, which was to be her first great success. During the 30s, she had written 4 rather slight comic novels, none of which had done especially well. The last and best of them, Pigeon Pie, having the particular misfortune to come out in May 1940, a month after the invasion of Norway, 4 days before the invasion of Holland and Belgium, and less than 3 weeks before the fall of France. Unsurprisingly, it sank almost without trace, an early casualty of the war. As Nancy's publisher, Hamish Hamilton, told her, it was not lucky in the moment of its publication. Since then, Nancy's life had changed dramatically. For the first time, she had fallen deeply in love, her lover, the brilliant and charming Gaston Paleski, with whom she had met when, as a member of the Free French Forces, he was for a while in London with General de Gaulle. Through her relationship with Paleski, unsatisfactory although in many ways it was, she found a new maturity as a writer. Now she was in the frustrating situation of longing to begin work, but unlike Evelyn, unable to afford either the time or money to do it. She longed to start, she told him, but pounds, shillings and pence rear that ugly head. I write so slowly, and my books always come out at moments of crisis and flop. My last 2 never come with their advances, and as you know, that is not encouraging, and one was a loss to Chapman and Hall. Then the project had to be further postponed because of the Christmas rush at the shop, complicated this year by the fact that there are no other presents to be given but books. Today, 2 quite separate people came in and asked me to think of a book for the Duke of Beaufort. He never reads, you know, they said. If somebody could write a book for people who never read, they'd make a fortune. But Evelyn encouraged her not to give up. It is good news that you may take up the pen again. Please give the results to Chapman and Hall. They love losing money, and I will get you a substantial sum over advance. In the event, Nancy decided to stay with Hamish Hamilton, who had been both courteous and supportive over the Pigeon Pie fiasco. And finally, in March 1945, Hayward Hill gave her 3 months off, which she spent staying with her sister Deborah at Ashford in Derbyshire. From the first sentence, the book flowed from her pen. It was intensely autobiographical, telling the story of her family and childhood, and under the alias of her heroine, Linda, her falling in love with her free Frenchman. She found the writing of it compulsive. Never before had a book come so easily, and never would it do so again. Evelyn was pleased for her sake. How delighted I am to hear you are writing a great English classic too. What a subject. Tell your publisher at once, or it will not be paper for months after it is written. Nancy admired Evelyn's work without reserve. Although her nature lacked the savagery and cynicism of his, there were many elements in his fiction, particularly his high spirits and idiosyncratic wit, that she felt were similar in many ways to her own. She looked up to him as her mentor, and it was now that she turned to him seriously for advice, now that their teacher-pupil relationship was firmly established. You are share mate to me, she told him, with your well-known knack of one tap on the nail and in it goes, whereas the rest of us hammer and pound for hours. Nancy started by asking, should she employ the first person, something she had never before attempted. Evelyn was ambivalent. He had tried it himself twice, in Brideshead, and in that brilliant and disturbing fragment, Work Suspended, which he abandoned on the outbreak of war. The first person singular is the most treacherous form of narration I found, he told her. It is so fatally easy in some ways. One can go on and on and on, almost effortlessly, and then one comes up against something the eye cannot possibly say, which must be said. However, she felt it was right, she should give it a try. I believe you will manage it more skillfully than I did. He gave her further advice. For instance, on the description near the beginning of the novel of Alkerley, home of the Radlett family, whose head was Favre, Fanny's, the narrator's terrifying Uncle Matthew. Uncle Matthew, by the way, a portrait of Nancy's father, Lord Redesdale, shared certain character traits with Evelyn. According to Fanny, Uncle Matthew either loved or he hated, and mostly, it has to be said, he hated. Evelyn had an insatiable appetite for the macabre, and his suggestion of the leitmotif of death in various forms, brilliantly developed by Nancy, is typical. At Alkerley, there was no attempt at decoration, at softening the lines, no apology for a facade. It was all as grim and as bare as a barracks, stuck up on a high hillside. Within, the keynote, the theme, was death. Not death of maidens, not death romantically accoutred with urns and weeping willows, cypresses and valedictory odes, but the death of warriors and of animals, stark, real. It was Evelyn, too, who suggested the title of the novel. Originally, Nancy had wanted to call her book Linda, but Evelyn thought this was boring and sent her a list of 15 alternatives. She wrote to Hamish Hamilton, "Evelyn has been teasing me rather about Linda and has finally written out these titles. Will you cast an eye over them if you have a moment? I like Linda in Love very much, also The Pursuit of Love, also Linda or The Quest." I expect he was right, and plain Linda is a bit dull. Nancy sent Evelyn the finished manuscript. He was unreservedly enthusiastic about the first half, describing Linda's childhood, but considered the second half full of faults, specifically the long section when Linda goes to Perpignan to help her communist husband Christian organise a camp for Spanish refugees. This, he thought, should be entirely rewritten. But Nancy couldn't face it, mainly, she said, because there simply wasn't time. "I'm sorry you have not been able to rewrite the unsatisfactory section of your book in time for the first edition," Evelyn wrote to her sternly, "but start rewriting it now for the Penguins. It is the difference, one of 1,000 differences, between a real writer and a journalist, that she cares to go on improving after the reviews are out and her friends have read it, and there is nothing whatever to be gained by the extra work." Nancy, however, felt she had done her best and couldn't face the prospect of extensive revision. "I can't begin again on Linda, so I am a journalist. Besides, I meant Christian to be like that, even if communism isn't." Evelyn said no more, but after the book was published, he told Diana Cooper, "Nancy Mitford has written half a brilliant novel about her childhood. The adult half is no good, but do read the beginning." The Pursuit of Love made its appearance on the 10th of December 1945. It was an immediate and phenomenal success. If ever there were an instance of the right book at the right time, this was it. Funny, frivolous, and sweepingly romantic, it was the perfect antidote to the long war years of hardship and austerity, providing an undernourished public with its favourite ingredients: love, childhood, and the English upper classes. For the first time in her life, Nancy had money to spend, and more in love than ever with Gaston Pailleski, her darling colonel, she called him, she spent it on moving to Paris to be near him, leaving her job at Hayward Hill, and eventually buying an elegant little apartment on the Rue Monsieur. Evelyn missed her presence badly. "No one departure has left such a yawning hole in London as yours," he told her. But in fact, the friendship, far from fading, now became consolidated by letter. Both Nancy and Evelyn were at their best on paper, and they knew exactly how to amuse and entertain each other. They knew the same people, liked the same jokes, read many of the same books. They shared a highly evolved and idiomatic language. They both were brilliant performers, hilariously witty, sometimes cruel, frequently childish. They both drew on deep wells of anger and disappointment. They were both prejudiced, provocative, arrogant, and essentially kind-hearted. They quarrelled, of course, chiefly on account of Nancy's, in Evelyn's eyes, culpable refusal to treat the spiritual side of life seriously. But Nancy had all the qualities he looked for in his worldly women friends. She was smart, sophisticated, funny, and above all, brave. Not only was he unable to cow her with his bullying tactics, but it was Nancy, with her unerring eye for psychological truth, who saw through what she called his iron mask to the bronzed figure beneath. She saw past the ugly image of irascible old buffer and forgave him willingly his frequently appalling conduct. When from time to time he came to stay with her in Paris, he usually left behind him a trail of quarrels, hurt feelings, and lunches and dinners ruined by inexcusably bloody behaviour. When Evelyn left for London, Nancy said, she always felt shattered like the morning after an air raid. Understandably anxious to follow up her success, particularly as she had now decided to remain in Paris for good to be near the Colonel, the Fabrice of her story, she needed a substantial income to support herself in that expensive city. She was eager, therefore, to start another novel as soon as possible. The trouble was, she had no plot. Again, she turned to Evelyn. What could she write about? He saw her problem clearly. I foresee great professional difficulties for you, he told her. You have used your two great plots, Far and Fabrice. You have set yourself up in a style of life which only continuous success can support. You have isolated yourself from my cosmopolitan riffraff from the sufferings of your fellow countrymen. What will you write about, unless you make yourself an historical writer of the 20s? You might perhaps start a genre of Sally Cady, Elizabeth and her German garden about exile in Paris. None of this appealed to Nancy, but she urgently needed to start earning. It was here and now in the Colonel that she worried about. Yes, it is dreadful now I've got a taste for money, and especially spending it, which is worse. I mean, if I were merely a miser, it wouldn't matter so much, she wrote to Evelyn. Also, you see, what nobody else seems to, that having used that Far and Fabrice, I'm utterly done for. All the rations have gone into one cake. Now what? A life for somebody, perhaps. But would I have the application? Not living here, I'm afraid. Evelyn was not about to let her off the hook too easily. He had little patience for her rose-coloured view of France and the French. According to Miss Mitford, everything to do with her newly adopted country was completely perfect, while England was cold, dirty, and irredeemably second-rate. Paris was the most beautiful city in the world. London was so hideous it made one physically ill to go there. The weather in France was sunny and warm. In England, one froze to death in those unheated houses, and it never ever stopped raining. Even the smells characteristic of the two countries exemplified the contrast. France was women's scent and chestnut flowers and rich garlicky cooking, while in England one was made literally to retch by the smell of stale sweat, cold mutton, dirty clothes, and unwashed hair. The day one sets foot in France, you can take it from me, Nancy told Evelyn, pure happiness begins. Every minute of every day here is bliss, and when I wake up in the morning, I feel as excited as if it were my birthday. Evelyn was unpersuaded. I have long recognized your euphoria as a pathological condition. Rightly recognizing that Nancy's great strength lay in her ineradicable Englishness, he was convinced that she must drop this nonsense and return to her roots. If she did not, her literary future would be dim, as he didn't hesitate to tell her. You see, even the most bookish and meditative minds, like Aldous Huxley's Decay and Exile, he never wrote a good novel after Anti-K. You were so topical and on the spot and so radically English that you must feed on a fresh English diet. As an English observer thinking foreigners absurd, you might be able to write about them. As a cosmopolitan, you are lost. But if she did take his advice and adopt an English theme, you want her to avoid at all costs Britain can take it, and memories of how matey you are with the lower classes at the Warden's Post. Nancy had small interest in writing about the lower classes, and she took to heart her mentor's point about keeping to what she knew, in other words, England and the English. But the more she struggled to think of a story, the more hopeless she became. In November 1946, she wrote, I'm in great despair. I can't write a line. I try and try, make beginnings which get nowhere at all, and simply nothing happens. Isn't it awful? If only she could think of a plot. How she envied novelists like Waugh himself and Graham Greene, who need never be stuck. I do think Catholic writers have that advantage. The story is always there to hand. Will he, won't he, will he, won't he, will he save his soul? 5 months passed and still no progress to be made. In April she complained, I cannot start another book. I got a beautiful idea for one and wrote a promising first chapter, and then suddenly realised it's exactly the same story as Pursuit of Love, which clearly won't do. Oh dear. It was not until September 1947, when she was told a true story about some people she slightly knew, that suddenly the idea for her book came to her. Immediately she wrote to Evelyn. May I ask your help? It's about my next novel. I've got a story for it, and the story is roughly this. Lord and Lady Mondor, infinitely grand and rich, he an ex-viceroy, absolutely top Englishman, she a Bulgarian, not unlike my mother-in-law. They have one daughter, Leopoldina, no heir. This is not much of a sorrow to them, as they love their daughter so much, but they do rather imagine that she will marry, if not the Prince of Wales, then some terrific duke. Rather disturbed when she reaches the age of 23 unmarried. She is beautiful but dumb. Lord Mondor has a sister married to a Mr. X, who is a great deal at their house and fetches and carries for Lady Mondor, and probably is her lover as well. Lady Patricia X, very delicate, stays at home a good deal. She dies. Picture the situation when a week after the funeral, Leopoldina announces she is going to marry Mr. X. Now, I need the impact of the Radcliffe family upon the Mondors, contrast between Aunt Sadie and Lady Mondor, the two neighbouring households, and the Radcliffe children's comments on the whole affair. I've got over them not having met in the Pursuit of Love by the Mondors being in India. What I want to ask you is, can Fanny tell the story again? I find it so much the easiest formula, but I know people did object and said I cheated by Fanny describing things she didn't see. I'm in a great do about it because I'm not knowing quite how to tackle it, but I've got a great many of the situations in my head and ought soon to begin. I do apologise for bothering you, but you're always so kind. The fact is I've begun to be appalled by the difficulties of technique, a thing which has hitherto never worried me at all. Evelyn replied, an insoluble problem, because of course one always wants to say how one would write the book oneself, not how the chum should. I'm sure you should stick to first person. It suits you perfectly. But the advantage of first person is the eyewitness account. Can the first person you have chosen see enough for herself? Only you can answer that. My fear would be a series of conversations in which other characters come to consult her about their problems so that the readers get the action second hand. Is there no observer nearer to the centre of things? I'm sorry not to be more helpful, but at this stage of the story it is an unquickened embryo, and the best gynecologists can do no more than advise temperate habits. Excited though she was, Nancy found the book hard going, infinitely more difficult to write than The Pursuit of Love. She was no longer spinning out her own story, and as a result was having to put much more effort into the construction of plot and the development of character. Oh, my novel has stuck, she wailed to Evelyn. I'm in despair. I can't get on with it. Yet there is too much that's not bad to scrap it all together. Besides, I must make some more lovely money. This new flat of mine seems perfect in every way for working. Charming servant, absolute quiet like the country. But the story won't go. Can't think what's to happen next. I've done 20,000 words and I'm in a misery. Evelyn was sympathetic, but uncompromising. I think it a very good sign that you find the writing of your new book painful. It is when it runs easily off the pen that one grows apprehensive. Love in a Cold Climate, or Diversion as it was first called, was finished in September 1948. The manuscript dispatched to Peers Court for comment. Evelyn read it with care and returned a lengthy reply. If Nancy had thought that all that was needed was a little fine-tuning, then she must have been dismayed by his letter. The book needs 6 months hard, I'm afraid, without permission for good conduct. The manuscript was a delight to read, full of wit and fun and fantasy. The theme is original and promising. There is not a boring sentence, except page 274. But it isn't a book at all yet. No more 40-hour week, blood, sweat and tears. That is to say, if you want to produce a work of art. There is a work of art there, lurking in a hole, occasionally visible by the tip of its whiskers. After this broadside, he settled down to more detailed criticism. The Radlets, of course, steal the scene again. Jassy and Victoria are intoxicating and real, so real that every other character pales beside them, except Cedric, who, deplorably, is made to talk in places in exactly their idiom. This is a trick you must look out for. Your great failure as boy, who is too important to be left as he is a mere collection of attributes. I don't believe that in a pompous house, a newly arrived, shy girl would be greeted by jibes about her mother's adultery. I know less of French manners, but it is inconceivable to me that Fabrice would talk to a jeune fille as you make him. Davy was a good foil to Uncle Matthew, but he loses point beside Cedric and Boy. The punctuation is pitiable, but it never becomes unintelligible, so I just shouldn't try. It is clearly not your subject. The narrative doesn't begin until chapter 3 and is just developing an intricate and highly enjoyable climax when the siren goes and down tools. I should mention that, granted the awful failure of Boy to come to life at all, you handle the Polly-Boy relationship admirably everywhere. Now, the book must be saved, so start again. Have no explanations, assume your reader knows Pursuit of Love, and plunge him straight into alchemy with the lecturer's first lascivious visit. Then follow him to Mondor and show him was the Jagger. Jagger was private war slang, meaning a useful and slightly sycophantic friend. Then, if you like, pack them off to Delhi and start again at your chapter 3. From then on, all you have to do is watch the characters and make them speak and behave consistently. Then, at the end of part 2, chapter 8, you can get really to work on the serious architectural achievement. It is a Henry James theme, told in a lighter way. Think how James would have developed the final chapters and then write them in your own delicious manner, and we shall have a memorable book. Well, I suppose you will hate me now for the rest of our lives. Nancy didn't hate him. Indeed, she was grateful, but equally she knew she couldn't do as he required. The teacher was too ambitious for his pupil. Dearest Evelyn, you are really kind to have taken so much trouble. I agree with nearly all you say. I've always known that Boy was too sketchy and that the beginning is clumsy. I've rewritten the whole thing once already, you know. What I wonder is whether I can and capable of doing better. You speak of Henry James, but he was a man of intellect. You must remember that I'm an uneducated woman and that I've done my best and worked hard already. Oh dear, you see, I'm afraid that what you really criticise are my own inherent limitations. Luckily, you also find something to admire, that is one comfort. But I do feel quite sure that I'm incapable of writing the book you want me to. I can't do more really than skate over surfaces. For one thing, I'm rather insensitive, as you know, and for another, not very clever. I will have a go at Cedric's talk and do some revising on the lines you suggest. It's not that I don't wish it were better, but only that I know I couldn't do any more to it, and if I worked for 6 more years, it wouldn't be any different. Love in a Cold Climate was published in July 1949 to even greater acclaim than its predecessor. The critics extolled it. It was the first novel ever to be chosen simultaneously as Book of the Month by the Book Society, the Daily Mail, and the Evening Standard, and the catchy title was soon on everybody's lips. Nancy sent Evelyn a copy, but made the mistake of sending it without a personal message written inside. Love in a Cold Climate has arrived to temper the heat wave with frigid absence of inscription, he wrote. But then he pulled himself together to tell her what he thought of the finished product. I've reread the first half already and look forward to a very happy afternoon with the second half. It is all very much better than I remembered it. I was quite wrong in advising, as I think I did, that you should scrap the first 2 chapters. They are very well written. Indeed, all the descriptive and narrative passages are very good. Conversations poor. Page 28 is hell. But I was wrong in thinking that publication would light your career. The book will be a great success and is appearing at just the right time when everyone longs for something like. I can't tell yet whether I shall enjoy the end, which I thought so inefficient before. I think I shall. One of the great comic characters in Love in a Cold Climate, as Nancy had known she would be, is that sacred monster, Lady Mondor. Lady Mondor, magnificent in her rudeness, magnificent in her grandeur. I think I may say we put India on the map. Hardly any of one's friends in England had even heard of India before we went there. No. She was largely inspired by Nancy's terrifying mother-in-law, Lady Rennell of Rod. And here we come to an interesting example of cross-fertilization, of how both Evelyn and Nancy drew their fictional characters from life, and not only that, drew on some of the same people for use as models. Not surprisingly, when you come to think of it, as they did after all move in much the same circles and found many of the same people odd, funny, repulsive, or otherwise worthy of novelistic attention. With Lady Rennell, the connection is particularly interesting, if perhaps a little difficult to follow. Lady Rennell was born Guthrie, and her brother Charles Guthrie married an American who was the sister of Jessie Graham, mother of Evelyn's great friend at Oxford, Alistair Graham. It was Jessie Graham who was the inspiration for Lady Circumference in Decline and Fall, and for Mrs. Cumberland in the short story Winner Takes All. Lady Rennell, alias Mondor, and Mrs. Graham, alias Lady Circumference, although connected only through marriage, had much in common. Lydias Rennell, wife of Sir Rennell Rod, one-time ambassador to Rome, was a prima donna, a woman who loved ordering other people about, a firm believer in speaking her mind. Behind her back, the embassy staff referred to her as Lady Rude or Tiger Lil. Although she claimed she lived for beauty, this was not an impression easily obtained from her personal appearance. She had no interest in clothes. When in Rome, her one hat was sent back to London every year to be retrimmed, and she was defiantly indifferent to fashion. Lady Mondor, too, is famous for her terrible, relentless rudeness, her candour, and her impressive dowdiness, which is so astonishingly transformed after the arrival of Cedric. Jessie Graham was a similarly Red Queen character, dowdy, eccentric, bossy, and very much larger than life. Her chief occupations were trying to persuade her layabout son Alistair to pull himself together and do some work, and undertaking extensive renovations for her house at Barford in Warwickshire, where Evelyn often stayed. Here is Mrs. Graham at home, as reported in Evelyn's diary. As usual, Barford is in a ferment of reorganisation, a lodge being torn down and pond dug, paving being laid, all the bathwater being pumped into the pond, Mrs. Graham full of port, roaring about, directing everything. This morning there was a great trouble with a large, truculent undergardener who is under notice to go and will not allow his successor to use his cottage. Mrs. Graham: here am I, left without a man in the house, looking hard at me. If he were alive, he'd have kicked him out. It is not a million miles from this to Lady Circumference, laying down the law to Dr. Fagan on sports day in Narber Castle. A stout elderly woman, dressed in a tweed coat and skirt and jaunty Tyrolean hat, advanced to the doctor. "Hello," she said in a deep bass voice. "How are you? Sorry for late. Circumference ran over a fool of a boy." She gave Dr. Fagan a hearty shake of the hand that obviously caused him acute pain. Then she turned to Paul. "So you're the doctor's hired assassin, eh? Well, I hope you keep a firm hand on my toad of a son. How's he doing?" "Quite well," said Paul. "Nonsense," said Lady Circumference. "The boy's a dunderhead. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be here. He wants beaten and kitten and dogging about generally, and then he'll be no good. That grassy shocking pile on the terrace, doctor. You ought to sand it down and resow it. What do you pay your head man?" There is, if you can bear with me, a further and very intriguing connection. Lady Rennell was the mother of Peter Rod, who had been at Oxford with Evelyn in the early 20s, and whom Nancy married in 1933. Both Evelyn and Nancy regarded Prod, as he was universally known, as something of a joke. Prod was a rebel and buccaneer, sent down from Balliol for having a woman in his rooms, always getting into scrapes, drawn like a magnet to wars and revolutions, preferably in remote and dangerous corners of the world. He was handsome, clever, an excellent linguist, and remarkably well informed about almost everything under the sun. He was also long-winded and a notorious bore. In the pursuit of love, Nancy used him as a model for both Linda's husbands, Christian Talbot, the high-minded idealist, and the pompous, handsome Tony Crosick. Tony was a first-class bore. He had a habit of choosing a subject and then droning round and round it like an inaccurate bomb aim around his target, ever unable to hit. He knew vast quantities of utterly dreary facts, which he did not hesitate to inform his companions at great length and in great detail, whether they appeared to be interested or not. Evelyn had been briefly at Oxford with Praed and never much liked him. Although, as V.S. Pritchett put it, Praed was one of the figures who continued to barge about in Waugh's imagination, so much so that he used him as part model for that comic colossus, Basil Seal. Basil makes his first appearance in Black Mischief, published in 1932. Basil, like Praed, was handsome, sexy, argumentative, and often aggressively rude. He was also exceptionally well informed and loved nothing better than to instruct his audience, completely insensitive to that audience's desire to be instructed. Here are two society ladies discussing him. No, the truth about Basil is just that he's a bore. No one minds him being rude, but he's so teaching. I had him next to me at dinner once, and he would talk all the time about Indian dialects. He's done all kinds of odd things. Well, yes, and I think that's so boring too. Always in revolutions and murders and things. I mean, what is not to say? Evelyn and Nancy draw on other common characters. For instance, Cyril Connolly, who appears as Everard Spruce in Unconditional Surrender, and as Ed Spain in The Blessing. Lady Diana Cooper comes on stage with no disguise at all in Don't Tell Alfred, her part that of the spoilt and beautiful Lady Leone, the outgoing, reluctantly outgoing British ambassadress in Paris when Fanny and her husband arrived to take over. And Diana Cooper is, of course, the original Mrs. Stitch, who first appears in Scoop and has a crucial, if somewhat sinister part to play in Officers and Gentlemen. The Blessing was the third and last of Frances' novels with which Evelyn gave substantial help. She dedicated to him not only in gratitude for his trouble, but in graceful reciprocation for his dedication to her of his novella The Loved One, the year before. After reading The Blessing, he wrote a letter full of praise. The Blessing is admirable, deliciously funny, consistent and complete, by far the best of your writings. I do congratulate you with all my heart and thank you for the dedication. Naturally, he had a number of criticisms, mainly to do with her portrayal of the Connolly figure, Ed Spain. He also tried, not for the first time, to correct her grammar. This was part of a long-running dialogue, Nancy complaining that as she had never been properly educated, quite untrue. She had had a good education from governesses at home based on the PLEU system. She was incapable of grasping even the most basic rules. In 1950, the year before The Blessing, Nancy had translated into English Madame de Lafayette's Princesse de Clare. She wrote to Evelyn, "Claudel has some very interesting things to say about translating English and French, but I didn't understand it all because I don't know the terms of grammar. I literally don't know what subjunctive, for instance, means. Is it too late to learn? If not, is there some easy book that would tell me? Oh, can I be bothered? The horror of not having been educated when young." Obligingly, Evelyn tried to explain what he could, going through her text and pointing out the worst errors. Darling Nancy, preface, page 1, paragraph 1. Allowances have been made for her both by her contemporaries and ever since. Here, you will put two linguistically dissimilar forms into close association. Perhaps it is not absolutely wrong grammatically, but it is barbarously inelegant. You must either say, both in her own time and ever since, or both by her contemporaries and by posterity. See? He sent her Fowler and recommended that she read it. "I've struggled with your grammar," she told him, "and it fascinates me, but I can't see how to use it. The odd thing about the grammar is I can see at once why all its examples are wrong, So why don't I see when it's me? Bother. Evelyn also tried to make her more aware of meaning and usage, ticking her off for employing words carelessly. She had, he told her, misused the word protagonist. It is an English word meaning leading actor. Some dramas, most Greek dramas, but not, for example, Aeschylus, have only one leading actor, such as Hamlet. But other plays, for instance Macbeth, 2 protagonists, Julius Caesar, 3 protagonists. If you only allow one protagonist, you have to use deuteragonist and tritagonist, which are not English at all. Eke was another word she got wrong. You do not understand the meaning of the word eke. It means to make something last longer by adding something else to it. For example, eke out butter with margarine. When you write, I might as well eke out a month in London as anywhere else, you commit a gross vulgarism. She was in error too over aggravate. In 1962, Nancy published a collection of essays entitled The Water Beetle, after Belloc's rhyme from the Moral Alphabet. The water beetle here shall teach a sermon far beyond your reach. She flabbergasts the human race by gliding on the water's face with ease, celerity, and grace. But if she ever stopped to think of how she did it, she would sink. Fearing that this, when applied to herself, might sound immodest, Nancy made a few changes, including the substitution of aggravate for flabbergast, so that the lines read, she aggravates the human race by gliding on the water's face. This, as Evelyn tried to explain, made no sense. In the end, however, he gave in. Aggravate, of course, you can use it to mean what Nanny meant, but Belloc would not have done so, and if it is meant as an adaptation of him, it rings false. Never mind, I am just a retired schoolmaster. Fewer than 1,000 readers will notice, and of them most will be pleased because it will give them a momentary sense of superiority. During this period, Evelyn as well gave Nancy some wise counsel over the conduct of her professional life, for instance, introducing her as a client to his agent, A.D. Peters, warning her against reissuing her early novels. I urge you not to republish Juvenilia without rewriting, but you never take my advice, you are so lazy. And at considerable length, instructing her how to deal with her public. In July 1952, she wrote to him, what do you do with all the people who want interviews with fan letters and with fans in the flesh? Just a barrage of no's? Do you answer their letters? But then I'm not you, and for some reason they all think from my books that I'm very nice. I should ask E.M. Delafield or Angela Thurgle for advice, not you. Evelyn took time with his reply. I'm not greatly troubled by fans nowadays, less than one a day on the average. I divide them into A, humble expressions of admiration. To these a postcard saying, I'm delighted to learn that you enjoyed my book, E.W. B, impudent criticism, no answer. C, bores who wish to tell me about themselves, postcard saying, thank you for an interesting letter, E.W. D, technical criticism. For instance, one has made a character go to Salisbury from Paddington. Postcard saying, many thanks for your valuable suggestion, E.W. E, humble aspirations of would-be writers. If attractive, a letter of discouragement. If unattractive, a postcard. F, request from university clubs for a lecture, printed refusal. G, request from Catholic clubs for lecture, acceptance. H, American students of creative writing who are writing theses about one and want one virtually to write their thesis for them, printed refusal. I, tourists who invite themselves to one's house, printed refusal. J, manuscripts sent for advice, returned without comment. I also have some postcards and my photograph on them which I send to nuns. In case of very impudent letters from married women, I write to the husband, warning him that his wife is attempting to enter into correspondence with strange men. Oh, and of course K, autograph collectors, no answer. L, Indians and Germans asking for free copies of one's books, no answer. M, very rich Americans, polite letter. They are capable of buying 100 copies for Christmas presents. I think that more or less covers the field. With this letter, Evelyn enclosed 2 sample postcards. One printed with "Mr. Evelyn Waugh greatly regrets that he cannot do what you so kindly suggest," on which he has written for Nancy's benefit, all purposes. The other bearing the legend, "Mr. Evelyn Waugh is abroad and his letters are not being forwarded. He will deal with them on his return," on which he had written, "useful for people who want to visit one." Nancy's last work of fiction, Don't Tell Alfred, was published in October 1960 to a marked lack of enthusiasm from the critics. Evelyn, on the other hand, described it as her most mature and satisfactory story. She told him that as the book had been so badly received, "I can see the time has come to chuck it, and I spend my days in little remaining eyesight counting up my money." This was not, of course, entirely true. Frederick the Great and the phenomenally successful The Sun King were still in the future. But Nancy never wrote another novel, and her letters to Evelyn from then on were concerned only with gossip, interspersed with occasional sharp-set twos about religion, the subject for him of profound importance, for her more in the nature of a flippant tease. In 1966, Evelyn died, sadly missed by his pupil in Paris. "Oh, Evil, has one been so sad? I'm in despair. He was such a close friend, and I suppose knew more about me than anybody. Oh, alas, I believe of all my friends, I really loved him most." Thank you.
Thank you, Selina. That was unbelievably eloquent and beautiful and touching. I think it's very easy to forget, well, not perhaps in this room, but in the outside world, how much he was loved even more by a vast circle of friends. And obviously it's amusing to point out his rudenesses and his bluntnesses, and that got telescoped certainly in the early writing about him. But he was a complicated person who was very greatly adored. Now, we could have some questions, or even on this occasion some statements. People just want to say things, but it'd be nice to open it up into a conversation. And don't forget that Selina's expertise obviously isn't just about what she's been talking about. That's very interesting, but also about all those people that she met and knew, and the biography.
Well, I should also say, don't forget that I wrote that book a long time ago.
Yes, I was interested in one really boring
pedantic thing.
Yes.
Anyone, that little, I remember she said, so you made the mistake about the clip, it should have been an arrow, diamond brooch or such like. He writes back and quoted it saying, of course,
nowadays they don't reprint things, but if there is an opportunity, they'll do it. The implication of all this is that she's reading the first trade edition, and I can't believe that she wasn't sent the 1944 pre-publication edition, of which there were 50 copies.
Yes.
But clearly
She must have been.
She must have got it.
Yes.
So did she just not bother to read that? Does anyone know the answer to that? Someone does.
Yeah, I believe the 44 gift copies were essentially page proofs, non-page proofs, because they're not. I've seen page proofs as well; they're the same, and of course there's a lot of detail, but I think that the 45 UK1 has the clip, so that he corrected that error before the Chapman and Hall first edition. So she would have, if she is correcting him on the jewelry, then she must have read the 44.
Are you saying the arrow is in the trade edition? And no.
I'm almost positive.
But then he writes her saying, I won't be able to correct it. And in fact, all those things that Knox and everybody else wrote about the 45 pre-publication edition, he corrected for the trade edition. He's saying to her he can't correct it. That's what made me think she must have been reading the trade edition, UK1. Anyway, a bit confusing.
Well, I think that's a subject for an interesting paper.
Well, we've got the right people here to answer it. The other thing, actually, Bob, that came up in what Selina was saying was about the marginalia in Cyril Connolly's book. Weren't you actually present in Texas when Connolly saw those marginalia?
and I went to lunch, and we came back and they had a display of his books. His visit was coterminous with his 100 books of the modern movement, and they had, in typical Texas fashion, huge displays, many manuscripts or first editions. And as we walked by the one case, it caught his eye, and he looked at it. He was devastated, and he asked to have the copy brought out so he could read the rest of it. And he was most disappointed. I tried to console him by saying, well, Waugh was in a bad mood because he was surrounded by communists drinking bad wine and objected to Randolph Churchill, so that would put anybody in a mean mood, but it didn't seem to help. And yet, you know, the fact that Waugh had teased Connolly mercilessly for 20 years, it's odd that it always seems to surprise Connolly when he did it again.
Would anyone like to ask any specific questions, or as I say, make
I'd like to make a statement, which is, I've read Nancy and Evelyn Waugh's letters, but I just want to thank you for reading them so beautifully and bringing them to life, because I got a lot more humour and warmth and wit out of hearing you speak them than I had when I was reading them. I'm sure a lot of other people would agree. I think there's so much understanding in the way you read them and so much appreciation of their relationship. Really
someone made them into a play, didn't they? They were a two-hand play.
There was the Mitford girls, was that?
No, Evelyn and Nancy
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
were made into a play by, was it Charlotte Mosley or someone like that?
Oh no, I didn't think it was
No. Anyone see that?
I didn't know about it.
I think it was quite successful actually. But I agree, sometimes you read off the page, and I think with Nancy Mitford, there is a sort of rather slightly annoying upper class
Well,
frivolity around it.
all the Mitford sisters didn't really talk English, they talked Mitford. And it was very funny, and it was very affected. And the accent was very, what we would now seems to us very affected. And one of the favourite phrases was, "Oh, that's a little unfair," she would say. And I remember staying with Nancy's sister Dinah Mosley in Paris, and she asked Nancy's French translator to come to tea so I could talk to him. And he was a terribly nice man called Jacques Rousse, and he obviously spoke English perfectly because he translated Nancy's letters, but he wouldn't speak it. And so we were talking in French. And suddenly Jacques said something about Nancy, which Diana didn't like. And so she said in an undertone to me in English, "Oh, darling, that's a little unfair." And then without missing a beat, she said, "Oh, Jacques, so I'm pain juice."
She was, quite chilling to look at. I didn't meet her, but you obviously did. You walked her.
I loved her, yes. I mean, there was this terrible elephant in the room.
Which she never let out of the room.
No. Well, no, I mean, she'd talk about Hitler at the drop of a hat, and I remember my ghastly occasion when I took her out to lunch in a restaurant in London. I suddenly realised the entire restaurant was silent. Oh, darling, the jokes, it was so funny. But no, she was wonderful. She was very, very well read in English, French and German. She was terribly funny. She had an absolutely impeccable memory. And I'm afraid I was devoted to her.
Yeah, people fell under her spell.
Absolutely.
Ian Wilson, another one.
Yes.
Blubbed and blubbed. He couldn't stop blubbing when she died.
Well, yes, I introduced them.
Oh.
And I said to him, I remember at the time, that we were staying in Deborah's little house in, what's that village in the Cotswolds? Come out of my head. Near where they all lived. Swindon. Yeah, exactly, thank you. And Andrew Wilson said he wanted to meet Diana Mosley. And so I said to Diana, oh darling, I'd adore to meet her. So he was asked over to dinner with us, just the three of us. And I said to him on the telephone before, because I know what he's capable of, you are not to mention the H word. Of course not. Of course not. Anyway, he arrived and we had dinner. I had this carbonara, which I had rather a cold. And the conversation was not taking off as I hoped it would with those two extraordinary people. And it was all right, and talking about this, nothing particularly interesting. And then Diana suddenly said to me, "Oh, darling, how's your cold?" And I said, "Oh, it's better." She said, "Well, you know what you should have before you go to bed? You should have a little whiskey and lemon and honey and drink that, and then you'll be quite all right in the morning." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And there was a pause. She said, "Do you know who told me that?" And then the two of them were off like a couple of greyhounds. And nothing else was talked about all evening.
Yes, I've got some letters in the archive she sent to Papa, just going on about her mum as he was.
Really?
She was very obsessed with his charm. And I was always actually mystified, because she's the first cousin of Churchill, or
Yes.
they're actually first cousins, were they?
Yes.
Very close cousins.
She never liked Churchill.
And then off she was in a bar in Munich. That's what's so bizarre. The story never added up to me that they sat around in the bar in Munich until Hitler came into regularly, and eventually started smiling at him and chirping along. This was presumably the sister.
That was Unity.
That was Unity. But then later Diana joined in with all this, and then they've catalogued how many times Hitler met the Unity. It was 300 times or something. We don't think they were lovers. It's quite obvious there was some sort of spying or information going on.
But what people never take in about Unity, I'm not for a moment defending her, but she was retarded. I mean, she wasn't quite all there. And I've been through all her letters at Chatsworth. I mean, they're like a 9-year-old child.
Really? Is it true that Tom, the brother, slept with all of the sisters? That's what we're told.
I've never had that. So I did know of one of them, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Which one? Which one?
Dharma. But I just don't know that it's true. I mean, Tom was busy as a bird dog. He had girlfriends everywhere, so why he should bother with his sisters?
The more the merrier.
This is far more interesting.
Patrick?
Yeah, I hate to derail this conversation since it's getting rolling, but my question is about gender, which I suppose there is a kind of segue there. I was talking to a couple of people at breakfast about Mary Beard, the historian, and the scrutiny that she's subject to as a public female intellectual. And I was curious about your understanding of the relationship of Nancy Mitford and Evelyn Waugh, whether the fact of her being a woman and becoming a public figure, whether any part of their conversation had to do with her status as a woman or her responsibilities in that regard, or the challenges she would face. Because I think one of the most touching things about their correspondence is just the terms of equality and of pure friendship. I mean, outside of the fact that he was sort of the mentor and she was the pupil. But was there a gender component to that, to their conversation? And if not, did she have another mentor that assisted?
Was he been her only mentor?
Sorry?
So I didn't quite.
He's asking about the relevance of the gender between Evelyn and Nancy.
Did he advise her or speak to her at all about the fact of her being a woman author as opposed to...
I'm not sure that would have interested him, do you?
I don't, it doesn't seem to have, and so my...
Although there's that passage you read out about, she says, I'm a girl and I...
About education, I mean, yeah,
Yes.
that she wasn't well educated and so on, but...
Well, yes, that was one of her riffs. I mean, I don't think he would even thought in those terms, do you? I think she was a friend and
Right.
well, whatever sex she'd been, I think he...
And that's, yeah,
So, yeah.
I think that's...
I think it's in the essay on literary style. Waugh talks about different kinds of style, and he talks about, for instance, Lawrence, and says he has a slovenly style. And then he says about women's writing, that it's like a telephone conversation, and he cites Nancy Mitford as an example.
Oh, that's right,
Women
yes.
and Americans.
And no, I beg your pardon, yes.
Women and
and I think that in the letters that you were quoting, he's aware that he's trying to set up a different kind of aesthetic.
And she doesn't see it.
And no, that she doesn't need to do it, actually. In his reassessments, once the books are published, and it still works, and he hasn't done all the changes he wants, because it is this much lighter, sort of flippity-jibbit style, which is something that he also enjoys with Diana Cooper. Their letters are written in a completely idiosyncratic style as well, which is a great value for him. But I think that it's a sort of complex relationship, isn't it, when he can see what's wrong, but she can get away with it.
But it's so much part of her and what she is, and it's not going to. And she's, I mean, if you read her letters, I mean, her novel, the style in her novels, the style she writes in the novels, is exactly the same as in the letters.
Yes.
I mean, you could hardly tell one from the other. So yes, but he went along with it, didn't he? Wasn't it Raymond Mortimer who said she was, when he reviewed The Sand King, he said it was exactly like listening to an intelligent woman on the telephone.
Yes.
But I think he very much responded also to that wonderfully sort of gossipy.
Well, it's an art in itself.
It is, exactly. Which he was very good at himself, after all.
Do you think Nancy Mitford's books were better by virtue of her refusing to take his advice than they would have been had she done it?
I think it's funny actually, because he was most critical about The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, which are by far her best. And with The Blessing, which actually is not that good, and Don't Tell Alfred, which is practically awful, he praises her. So perhaps he saw how bad they were and didn't want to engage.
I think it wasn't worth the effort.
It wasn't worth the effort, exactly.
Yeah.
This piece of advice about not killing one's character to Nancy Mitford.
Sorry?
Waugh gave a piece of advice to a writer about not killing his character, I mean, making them survive throughout the different novels.
I think,
yes.
Doesn't that appear in the interview, television interview with
Yes, when he talks about
Elizabeth Jane Howard?
And he said Nancy Pole's being clever to keep the same characters going.
That's
So
right.
it was madness of him to kill them all off.
Yeah. And then the interviewer says, but you killed one or two off and to try and forward.
Do you remember that postcard that he sent Christopher after the Jane Howard interview? This was, Waugh didn't want to do this television interview, and Christopher Sykes was sort of saying, please come and do it. No, I don't want, I can't be bothered, and so on and so forth. He said, if I find you a really, really beautiful woman, will you come up and do it? Oh, well, all right. So
Elizabeth Jane Howard.
Elizabeth Jane Howard, who was.
Is she very pretty?
She was lovely.
Well, that was a
very
very
beautiful.
question.
So she does the interview, and she's like a sort of, it's like a snake and a rabbit. I mean, you can see she's absolutely terrified of him, but he's very courteous and so on. But then there's that postcard he sends to Christopher afterwards, just saying, not beautiful enough. Which I didn't really.
I just want to say about not killing the characters. Am I right in thinking that Nancy writes to Waugh after Men-at-Arms and says, were you right to kill off Apthorpe? I'm sure she does. So she sort of.
I've forgotten that.
Well, someone definitely writes to him and says that, and I think it's Nancy. So she has actually sort of taken that advice at some point, and then.
I've seen that quotation in my letter.
Yeah, I'm sure
Yeah,
she does.
I'm tracing
And then
now,
quotes it
but-
back to him, and I think he sort of half agrees and thinks, well, maybe I shouldn't have done actually, because he's such a good character, and he sort of gets rid of him in the first part of the trilogy. I think.
Well, that I didn't. I mean, one of her. Apart from her family, of course, her great character was Fabrice, the Colonel, Gaston Palevsky. And he was like a Frenchman in an English farce. And I remember when I first went to see him in Paris, and he had a little sort of garçonnière in the Rue Bonaparte. And it was on the first floor. And I went rather nervously in, I met him once before. And he behaved, I mean, as I say, like a farce. I was literally, when I played my tape recorder back when I got home, it's full of, no, s'il vous plaît, And then one of mine, rushing around the room, he had a beautiful collection of 18th century terracotta busts, which were on little tables about the room. And in one of my little flights, I knocked over one of these tables. I mean, both of us absolutely frozen with horror, but luckily it was only the telephone I'd knocked over. So from that moment on, he calmed down and he made me sit beside him on the sofa, on which I was told General de Gaulle had sat. And he held my hand, but that's as far as it went. Anyway, at the end of the interview, I said, Colonel, do you by any chance have any letters from Nancy? And he said, oh no, why should I have letters? We talked every day I was over, maybe one postcard and all, maybe I look to see more. So I went back to London, and then about 3 weeks later I got a letter from him saying, to his surprise, he had found a few letters. And if I liked to go back to Paris, he would have to go through them with me because he would have to explain the various allusions and so on. So I thought, well, here we go again. And went back, went upstairs to the first floor, and this time the front door was ajar. And I went in, and he was sitting in front of a huge, big mahogany table in his dining room that was literally covered with hundreds of letters. And he was quite different. And he said, I'm sorry, it makes me too sad to look at these, but you can have them as long as you promise me to return them when you finish. And that was really, you know, because both Nancy's executors, Diana and Deborah, had made it a condition. They said if you don't, the Colonel has always refused to talk about Nancy, and if you don't get his cooperation, there's no point in doing the book. And so this was really the great breakthrough. Incredible.
Was he very heterosexual?
Very.
Very, yeah, good. Totally clear from your description.
Oh, I mean, he is,
Yes.
except that she rather sort of upgrades him in the books, but I mean, he was unstoppable. I mean, he was a joke.
Yeah.
You know.
And her previous, the one she pined after, Hamish
Erskine.
What do you have to say about his sexuality?
Well, I think that he was gay,
Yeah.
100%, I think, and she just had a sort of teenage crush on him. It was like she was very late to grow up, wasn't she? Very grown up.
Yes. And fell out badly in the end with Diana.
No,
Did she recommend that Diana should not be released from prison?
yes,
And
but
that's not
Diana
back-
never knew that in her lifetime.
Oh, it was after she died, she found out, yeah.
Yes, she did. Nancy told Churchill she should be released, but Diana never knew that.
And Nancy herself was a fringely fascist in the 30s.
Very, very briefly, she and Peter Rod were sort of, for about 3 weeks, they were sort of swept up into it, but they then turned very much against it. Peter Rod was very left-wing,
Yeah.
and she was appalled by Unity and Mosley.
There's a letter which
Oh,
I'm sure you've seen, but it doesn't appear in the Evelyn Waugh letters to Nancy Mitford, where he congratulates her on getting married to Peter Rod in slightly stiff tones. And it was left out of the book because the date it was too early. It was 1933. Do you think it might be
Yes.
like that? Yeah.
But he can't have approved of it because he thought
No, he
well,
writes
it's
quite
ridiculous.
amusingly, but he says your books are going to be pretty ridiculous. We're going to have to base them all on this figure. But then anyone like to add a few? Yes.
One of the oddities of Waugh's letter is where he says it should be like a Henry James novel. I just wondered, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, that's interesting because she isn't at all like Henry James.
No,
is she?
absolutely not. Nor is he, really. Although he clearly admires Jane.
Well, I just wonder whether he said it to frighten her.
Certainly high standards.
Yes, exactly.
It had that effect.
It did. No, it couldn't be less like James.
Waugh came to James after the Second World War, I think from his father's library. And he says it's an uncovenanted blessing to have saved Henry James for middle age. And he spoke of James' style, it was absolutely precise, and it was impossible to mistake the meaning of any sentence. If you can get through it, that's my opinion. But, always spoke highly of James from that point on.
Well, I think he must have known, don't you, how much that would have daunted Nancy to be compared to James, or given James as the goal.
Assuming she tried to read James, that would have been very damaging, but I think he's talking about construction of scene rather than style.
Yes.
No one was more daunted by Henry James than Arthur Waugh. If you read One Man's Road, his father wants him to become a doctor, and he says, no, I want to be in literature. And so they get in touch with the cousin, Edmund Goss, and say, okay, little Arthur, if you want to be in literature, go and have lunch with Edmund Goss. And Edmund Goss gives a lunch where Arthur walks in, and there's Henry James and Arthur Conan Doyle, about three very eminent people anyway. And Arthur Waugh describes it brilliantly as absolute terror walking into this room. So maybe that Henry James was a weapon you used to intimidate people. Come down through the family.
Well, maybe that's just what England is doing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Selina. It's wonderful that you're here.